volgend jaar, voor de mensen die het al in het programmaboekje gezien hebben, we hebben volgend jaar nog 3 opleidingen. Dat is onze voorlopig laatste opleidingenreeks die ik ga geven. En Jamie gaat 2 dagen van de 4 geven bij de Vets en Cats. En hij gaat 2 dagen, waar we nu een intro over hebben, gaan we dan volledig uitwerken. Dus het is super om hem hier al te hebben, om jullie al een introductie te geven. Geef hem een daverend applaus. Jamie Rushton, they're all yours.
Thank you, I think. Okay, I just want to say thank you to all for staying so late, because I know this is towards the end of the day and maybe not a subject that everyone's going to be interested in, but I'm going to try and keep it fun and entertaining. And secondly, I just want to say I am sorry, but my Flemish is not very good, so it will be entirely in English. Can you hear me okay? Do you need me to keep it close? Okay, so let's get started, I guess. I'm relying a little bit on technology, so apologies again if things go a little bit wrong. But when I came up with this idea for this talk, it was based on a friend of mine at work, actually. And he came rushing out of a consult room once and he said, please help, basically. He says, you know, what drug should I use for this cat's behavior problem? And he's all hot and flustered and he's running down. I'm like, well, why do you want a drug at all? And he took me down to the consult room, and right there you could see this was the sort of scenario we had with the client and the cat. And so you can see why he wanted to use it, but still my question was, well, if you want one, there is definitely one to fix it, but that's probably the most likely one that will be recommended. And for those of you who don't know what that is, that's what we put cats to sleep with, or euthanize. And obviously, it's probably not the most politically correct thing to talk about, but I think it's a really important point, because this is actually the most commonly used drug in behavioral medicine, at least in the UK, and that's something we've got to change. And there's lots of reasons why, and that's what we've got to explore, because often, by the time we get to see the client as a behaviorist or a veterinary behaviorist, then, you know, they're at the end of their tether. They've probably already started to talk to their friends. Obviously, they've done the whole Google search and tried to work out what's wrong themselves. And, you know, they probably even tried their level 1 master Reiki hands, and maybe even gone and got the local Sherman to give them a helping hand before they'll even come through the door to us. And so we often see these things way too late in the scenario. So what could the vet do and what should the vet do? Well, definitely he should be investigating the medical causes. And also he should be getting a behaviorist involved if he is not a behaviorist himself. And the sooner he does this, really the better. Why? Because, unfortunately, most animals relinquish to an animal shelter because of a behavioral problem, and that's a high proportion of the shelter animals. They've been seen by a vet in the previous year, and still they're ending up being rehomed for the problem. And even when the owners have raised concerns about the behavior during the appointments, those concerns are unfortunately not really discussed the vet. So why? Well, unfortunately, behavior is not a core curriculum for us. Certainly in the UK, it's a sort of subsidiary subject, and yet it's vital for the understanding of all the medical conditions. Prior to vet school, a lot of students have had to do work experience, have been exposed to a lot of animal handling techniques, and probably think that they know what they're doing to a certain extent. So there's a little bit of naivety. And then there's the timing. You know, we are just expected to get it done, get it right, get it fixed. You know, the other problem is how short vet consults are. And I don't know what it's like on the continent, but in the UK, even in the best clinics, maybe half an hour you'll get given. And that's nowhere near long enough to even unfold what's going on with both the client and the animal. What about the personality types? How many of the actual vets are good psychologists? How many are good at talking to clients and communicate? And then, obviously, we've got an awful lot of unqualified TV personalities at the moment. Flavor of the month, take your pick, but they're all looking for quick fixes. And then even when we get to see the top of the tree, the board-certified veterinary behaviourists, unfortunately there's not very many of them, and their waiting list is too long for a lot of the clients. You know, the other problem as well is when you've had your long conversation, modification often changes the owner's whole lifestyle, and that's a lot for people. And these are people who want to do it, but it's hard work. And sometimes it's just because that's what the animal looks like in the consult room, isn't it? You know, who wants to put their hands on that beast and deal with it? So what we can do is definitely investigate the medical causes, and that's really important because medical health is really, really closely associated, intimately associated with behavioural health. It's so much so that we've even got a syndrome where most of the common presentations for a vet, so diarrhea, vomiting, weight loss, urinary tract signs, changes that would cause you to vocalise at night, like high blood pressure, so many of those could have a behavioural or a medical reason behind them. And so it's really important vets get on board with behaviour and don't see it as a sideline subject. It's integrated in everything we do. Let's take a classic sort of condition, hypothyroidism. A lot of people will know about this, and if you know about it a little bit, you'll know that it affects the way the immune system functions. So the neutrophils are cells that fight infection. Consequently, you're going to get urinary tract infections, and you're going to get the signs of inappropriate urination around the house, peeing on the bed, blood in the urine, and that's not the only way it does it. Even if you don't have a urinary tract infection from this problem, it's reduced the threshold for stress and it's increased anxiety. And that gets its own disease. And that is an inflammatory condition which is often sterile in over 98% of cases. So we've got two ways of getting the same problem. Well, there's a third way that happens because suddenly you've got conflict with the owner. You've got conflict maybe with the other pet, and now that's got a behavioural problem with its sibling or with its partner pet. That's going to add more stress, and that's going to give you the same problem again. So we can all treat hypothyroidism with medicine, surgery, diet, radioactive iodine therapy. We can all culture urine, look for the causes. But even if we do that, if we have not sorted out the conflict behaviour that's occurring between the owner or the other pets, and we get to this so late with the behavioural side of things, that problem is going to just carry on and persist, and we're going to be in trouble. So just to let you know what's going on behind the brain of a vet when they have a cat that comes in with peeing in the wrong place. You know, there's a lot of conditions. I'm not here to go through everything, although we will do that if you come to the Vets and Cats sort of conference next year. We'll go through a lot more of this stuff. But we know that there's going to be a lot of investigations. You know, these animals will definitely have multiple visits. There's all sorts of things that we need to do to differentiate between things on that list. So the first place that medicine might help is the stress associated with the visits. What can we do to improve that? Well, we can give medicines at home before they arrive at the clinic, and there's some very good drugs now that help that. And these drugs can be tested before you have the actual event to see what they're going to do. We have things that you can give for the blood tests to make things less anxious during the procedures themselves or the scans. And we have local anesthetic creams that will, again, just revolutionize the ease that you have for taking these samples for the animal as well. So, should we medicate? Well, I think the big thing we've got to remember is that these animals, it's easy for me to say, here's a brilliant drug, use this one, it'll always work. You've still got to get it into the animal in the first place, and that's far easier said than done. And that brings us to the point of compliance, and that's compliance for the animal and the owner. And that comes down to how many times do you have to give this drug? What is the taste of the medication? What is the form of the medication? Is it a tablet? Is it liquid, powder? And how many are you going to have to give? Not to mention the side effects. And remember, a lot of these drugs are borrowed from human medicine, so they're dosed and sized for the human and not for the cat that's about a tenth of the size, which makes it pretty tricky. But if you are successful and you can give the tablet and you think you're going to be okay, well, we've got further considerations. If the cat does have one of those other medical problems that we're doing, is it on medication for it? If it is, then what are the side effects and the interactions between those drugs? And we know that lots of the common drugs, so antibiotics, anti-sickness medications, we know that lots of the pain relief mechanisms that are employed by a lot of the drugs that we send cats home with, they all interact with some of these behavioral medicines. And if they interact in a really serious way, then it can happen to have something called serotonin syndrome. And this is where there's too much serotonin. And that occurs with several of the pain relief medications and some of the antiemetics. Luckily for us, in cats, that's not a common thing that happens, but it has been reported, and there is 33 cases of toxicosis from overdosing with some of the serotonin type of syndromes. What about supplements and nutrients as well? You know, a lot of these people are already giving these, and we haven't even probably asked the question, we just get the medicines out. But you need to ask, because there's a lot out there. And again, people have done Google searches, they've tried some of this, or they're on them and they're just not enough, but they won't think to just stop them. They will carry on, and they're hidden. You know, if you're buying Royal Canin's Calm Diet, it's got tryptophan in it. It's got alpha-casepine in it. You know, if you buy Calmex, it's got multiple of those things in there. And there's lots of people dabbling with things like cannabis oil, so I'll just mention it, and again, all of these things will break down into how they work and everything if you come to the big conferences. Probably a bit too much to go into for this at the moment. So what about concurrent diseases? If we have liver disease, then are we going to metabolize this drug properly? If we have gut disease, is the tablet even going to get into the system and do what it does at the dose? You know, fluoxetine, if you give it underneath the recommended doses, will not work. It doesn't matter how much. It's also shares a transporter with some of the food molecules. So tryptophan, for example, is commonly crosses the gut barrier with leucine and isoleucine, and as a consequence, if you have the wrong food on board, your supplement's not going to work either. So it's really important to get this information, and that's why the consults just aren't long enough. And what about the time to onset? Because a lot of the time these people are desperate. They need help now. And some of the conditions would require, if the animal is aggressive, or if they have been threatened by their neighbors or their landlord because, you know, they've got a problem that's a noise sensitivity or something like that that's causing disturbances. And then we've got to think about how quickly can we stop the drug in the animal if they're not having good effects, or if they're having poor side effects. Some of these take time and need to be stepped down, so you need to think about that if you envisage you might have compliance issues. And then there's obviously dependency and tolerance, and these are things that we know that can occur in some of the benzodiazepines, for example. Particularly, there's lots of studies in humans showing that, and as little as 14 days, and they're starting to become dependent on those drugs. The next section is probably the most important as well. We have a lot of unlicensed or borrowed drugs from the human medicine market. And whilst some of those drugs will work perfectly fine, you've got to remember that we do things differently than cats. Take paracetamol. It's a simple thing for us, benign, probably doesn't do much to be honest, but it kills cats. And as a consequence, when we extrapolate this information, we've got to really think about, are we putting the animal at danger rather than helping it? And why? Well, cats aren't small repackaged humans, are they? How similar, how different are we really? Well, they taste differently, they see differently, they hear differently, and they smell differently. Which begs the question, do they actually feel differently as well? Who knows what they're actually thinking? We know that they probably are not thinking quite the same as we are. But the good news, and I feel like we need some good news, because I feel like I'm just saying that medicines are bad at the moment, and they're not. There are some good benefits to them. The good news is that we do share a lot of the anatomy, and sadly, a lot of the brain chemistry studies were performed on cats and were analysed in cats, and as a consequence, we know quite a lot about cats, probably more than humans. But what we need to be aware is emotions, and what emotions do they feel and share. And maybe they don't have the tertiary emotions such as contempt or jealousy, although if you're like me, you're probably sure that you have seen some of those things in your cats. The bottom line is that we probably have enough information to say that these medicines can be helpful. So let's look at why we might want to use them. And the first is to reduce stress when environmental enrichment will fail to adequately provide relief. So take your neighbours upstairs are having some building work. It's unlikely that you're going to be able to make your flat into a perfect environment and do all the enrichment that will knock the problem on the head. Really importantly, the drugs are really good at restoring normal patterns of feline behaviour. And if you imagine, if you've been chronically stressed for a long time, you are not going to sleep properly. You are going to be agitated. Your neural pathways will then change. There's lots of ways that happens with the neurotransmitters. But basically, you put yourself in a position where even if you wanted to try the environmental enrichment and do things, they're not ready for it. Their brain isn't quite set up. So it's a really good place that you can sort of have dual action. We also want to reset the barometer for stress, and that can be done with certain groups of drugs. Others are not doing that. But it is a really important thing, because if you think about yourself getting on a train late at night and some creepy person gets on, you're going to have a zone around you where you're suddenly going to become uncomfortable if that person enters into the zone. And then there's going to be a closer area around you that if they get into that, you're going to be fearful, not just anxious. And there'll be a point where you have to use flight, fight, freeze, or fiddle to get yourself out of that. So some of these drugs are really good at making those circles around you further away. And they just still let you feel stress and anxiety and fear, but they give you a bit of breathing room where you might find it's just not enough space to do it in your environment. On top of that, what about when owner's compliance is going to be poor? Let's be honest, not everybody has the time or the willpower to dedicate their life to the cat. I know, well, you probably would, but that's not the case for most of our clients. And then we've got obviously dangerous situations where aggression may be occurring, where we might find that the strategies are just, again, not going to be safe enough to implement. So there's plenty of reasons we should use these. We've already touched upon the visiting to the vets and reducing stress when things are only needed for short term. And that would be situations like your owner's going on holiday. You know, the rest of the time, the animal's actually well balanced and has got good coping strategies. So there's a place for some of these medicines in that sort of situations too. Unfortunately, we do have to touch a little bit onto the nervous system if you want to understand how these drugs are going to work. And I think it's important. I think it's probably more important than the drugs themselves. So let's be really basic about this. And effectively, this is a nerve cell. And we have 80 billion buddies to go alongside him. And each one of these is connected to another 1,000 neurons. It's an incredibly complex network of communication. But they don't actually physically touch in a lot of the synapses. And instead, they use chemicals to transmit their signals. And this is just a little short video, because I don't want to bore you. But basically, these are two neurons trying to communicate together. And what happens is that the signal comes down, it forms an action potential, and that causes the calcium-dependent channels to open, and what you see in there are the vesicles which would contain the neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters are activated by that influx of calcium, and then they're released across the gap. It's a very clever system, and they bind on the other side. So when we talk about all these fancy words, really that's all we're talking about. It's just the transmission of these chemicals, messengers across to pass the message on. And then the signal goes on. So let's go back to our old friend, and let's assume this picture is actually a representation of his emotional state, or affect as it's scientifically known. So what's going on behind this scene to actually get this to develop into this? Well, to look at this, we need to look beneath the surface. And I don't know how well that is something that you can see there, but basically I've broken the picture down into its colors, which is what every photo or every TV does for us. And it's a good way of sort of thinking about how things are going on. If you imagine that those pixels that you're seeing are kind of like the neurons, and you imagine those colors are more like the transmitters, then we know that we can create the emotions basically by the amount of receptors or amount of colors that you have there and neurons available. And we know that we can also move you on. We can also see that it's controlled not just as simply as the colors themselves, because if we add dimmers into the equation and we say that each of those colors can have a different intensity, then you can start to imagine how we can get multiple types of emotions developing. Think of it like spotlights on a wall. If the red is shining on its own, it will be red. It might be anger, right? If the green's there, it's green. If you have some red and green expressed, then you're going to get your yellows. And it gets more complicated, obviously, the more depth you get. And this is where the importance to highlight is that it's not just about one chemical. Serotonin isn't just our feel-good. You know, dopamine's not just our reward. These interact with each other. So while supplements may help, don't be blinded by the marketing. This is a really complicated thing, which is all to do with the interactions and the layers upon it. And this was explored a little bit by a psychologist in the human field, and he looked at the cube in that sort of idea. And if we look at that a bit further, we could probably start to see where these transmitters maybe are doing. Now, he chose three important guys: norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin, or noradrenaline, you might know it as. But if we add into that glutamate and GABA, then we're starting to suggest a little bit more what we're seeing with the drugs that we affect. Because if you think about GABA, that is a neural inhibitor. So it basically turns the whole system down. And glutamate is our sort of excitatory, which in excess causes seizures, but it turns the whole system up. And so most of the drugs we use are looking at these five neurotransmitters and chemicals. But stress is a bit more complicated than that. So if we introduce a couple more, then you might be familiar with things like oxytocin, which everyone calls the love product or love chemical. It's really made for trust and social bonding, though. And then if we look at serotonin, that's the big one, because that's where most of these drugs that are going to reset the points are having their effect. So serotonin is involved with confidence. It's that feeling where you feel you've done a good job and someone says, well done. It's that sort of contentment feeling rather than the euphoria that you get with dopamine. And these are really important to sort of look at all together, because in addition to this, there is another 50 that I could talk about. But I'm not. I want to try and keep it a little bit more simple for today. But cortisol, I think, is important. And I think that's the next section that we probably just touch on briefly. Because, you know, the autonomic nervous system is really important for fight or flight. And when we look at most behavior problems, we're going to be activating this system. And this is the sympathetic system, which kind of sounds nice, doesn't it? All warm and comforting, and, you know, it's going to be all friendly. But you'd be wrong. This is bells and whistles. This is the system that is going to activate when you're stressed, when you see a threat. And this uses acetylcholine and norepinephrine. And there's no reason to learn everything about them, apart from be aware that this is where most of the side effects occur. And that's the reason to highlight them. The other system that's involved is part of the sympathetic system, and that's where we send signals to our adrenal glands. And interestingly, they release norepinephrine again. They release epinephrine, which is adrenaline. And technically, they are considered hormones when they're released from the adrenal gland. If we look at its partner in crime, Then we've got the counterbalance to the sympathetic system, and this is the parasympathetic system. Its job is to sort of rein the sympathetic system in. It's the sort of yin to the sympathetic's yang, or, you know, the Watson to Sherlock Holmes scenario. And this is what we need to have working in balance for us to feel good well-being. If either one of them are out of tune, then we start to see side effects. That's using acetylcholine, and again, this is more complicated than we need, but we will go into lots of mechanisms if people want to at another day. So we've got a cat who actually likes to take his medicine, and it's the perfect compliant animal. And so we've got to come to the question of what drug do we use? And these are just some of the drugs that we start to use or could use. And it looks quite complicated when you sort of just label them out. There's enough there that have similar action, but just enough differences to make it become complicated and hazy. So a lot of vets choose not to, don't they? And that's probably the default. If in doubt, don't do anything. But let's try and organise them at least where we're going with things. And what people might be familiar with, if any of you are vets out here, is probably this set of 5. Most importantly is probably clomipramine. I don't know how many people have heard of that, but that's the only drug that has a license for behavioural medicine in cats anywhere in the world. And it's only in Australia that it has a license, and that's for urinary marking. The others that I want you to know about just today are those 3, and particularly this one, gabapentin, because I think if there's one drug to go home and remember the name of and tell people about for cats, it's gabapentin. It has completely changed the way that we handle cats in the clinic. We compare it with all sorts of other drugs, and it seems to have really good synergistic effects. So let's look at the most common class that people are aware of, and that's the benzodiazepines. Most people probably recognize the top 2. That's Valium and Xanax. And those drugs are really the ones that we will use in short-term situations. These do, as we just talked about, affect GABA, and they make GABA effectively work better. Basically, that receptor starts to fire more frequently, and more chlorine comes through, and therefore the cell beneath it depolarizes and can't do its job. So basically it shuts down that function, and it's very good at it. Now, diazepam I don't use at all. I've got to say I'm scared to death of the side effect profile on it. Only 6 cats reported to have that problem, where the liver has gone into failure, but who wants to use that when you've got better drugs that do the same thing? It's got a long duration of action, so some people do like it if they want to use it infrequently, and it's still very common to use. I like alprazolam. There are some others that bypass liver metabolism that, again, we can talk about, but not today. And I think that this drug is really quite good at what it does and predictable at what it does if we use appropriate doses. Problem with it, it tastes bitter. And you'll find that there's a problem with most of this stuff. So, you know, go buy your Licks, go buy your Easy Pill Pets, go buy your Greenies, and I don't know how many of these are available, but if Amazon is as marketable over here as it is where I am, there's lots of stuff now to help you try and deliver these stuff into the cat. We commonly use it for anxiety, fear, especially panic situations, but pretty much most stuff it's used for. Let's move on quickly then, because we've got just a couple of drugs to go through that I think are important. And these would be the biggest ones. So that's Prozac, that's fluoxetine. And these guys work by inhibiting the presynaptic transporter, which means that effectively you get more serotonin available. It's way more complicated than that, and it does take a bit of time to do its job for various reasons, but know that this is the one that helps you set the barometer. This is a really good drug, and it has really good side effect profile. So again, take home message, if in doubt, pick this one if you want an SSRI. The rest have some subtleties, but not enough to worry me if you chose them. This is peppermint flavor, so again, not the greatest drug in the world, I'm afraid, in that respect. because it selectively looks at serotonin uptake, it really is much less side effects than the next group of drugs, which is going to be talking about lots of side effects like gastrointestinal signs, particularly tummy upsets and insomnia. I think the next one that you might know about, like we talked about, is clomipramine and amitriptyline. And